Hi everyone, Glenn Peoples here. Some time ago, not that long ago, I did a video about what some modern Christians call speaking in tongues. And I looked at the idea that there is this angelic language and that those who speak in tongues might be speaking in the language of angels. A small number of people think that this is what St. Paul is talking about in 1 Corinthians 13, but we saw that there really wasn't any good evidence that Paul thought that way. And if you haven't seen that, go back and check it out. I think it's interesting. In this video, I'm going to walk through part of 1 Corinthians 14. Now, some people, again, some modern Christians of a Pentecostal persuasion, think that St. Paul described speaking in tongues as a gift of speaking in a spiritual language that we don't understand, as a way of edifying ourselves, building ourselves up spiritually. And I say that those who think that probably need to read Paul a bit more carefully. It's sometimes noted that reading 1 Corinthians is a bit like listening to one end of a telephone conversation. St. Paul didn't just wake up one day and decide that he was going to go and tell those Corinthians about how to have a worship session or what to do about food sacrificed to idols or whether or not women should be teaching in church or any of the things that that letter talks about. The letter is what's called occasional in nature. It was an occasional document, and that means that it was written because of and in response to a particular occasion that called for it. So it was stimulated by that and focused on that. The Corinthians were having problems. I think most people who read 1 Corinthians can tell that. And they had questions for Paul, so some of them, perhaps the ones who had finally had enough of all the problems, wrote to him. At one point, actually, Paul refers back to a letter like that, saying, "Now, concerning the matters about which you wrote," that's at the beginning of chapter 7. So by looking at the issues that Paul addresses with the Corinthians and how he does that, we can get some idea of what he had heard that he needed to correct or talk about. In particular, there was this phenomenon where it looks like Paul quotes a saying that originates with the Corinthians, or at least it's his understanding of what they were saying, and then he responds to that with a correction or some kind of instruction based on that. And some translations acknowledge that this does happen. They'll do that by adding speech marks around the part that Paul may be quoting from the Corinthians. And here are a couple of examples. So on the screen, I have adjusted the layout to really emphasize the conversation that Paul is having. So first of all, from the beginning of chapter 7. "Now, concerning the matters about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. But, because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, the wife does." You see what he's doing? He's starting with something that came from them, and he's saying, "Yeah, but," and then he's launching into a teaching of his own. Or from chapter 10, verses 23 and 24. "All things are lawful, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful, but not all things build up. Let no one seek his own good, but the good of his neighbor." Now, what's really crucial here is that if this is what's happening, and I think it is, the first claim, the one to which Paul responds, is not Paul's initiative. That's not what he was setting out to say. It's what the Corinthians have said, and he's replying to it. Now, that doesn't mean it must be completely false. It might be true, but simply misapplied. In the examples I just quoted, Paul doesn't actually contradict what they've said. He just kind of says, yeah, but. In other words, that's where you are, but don't forget this. It does mean, though, that we shouldn't regard that first statement as anything like Pauline theology, right? That's not what he is saying. Just because Paul wrote the words, he's responding to them. Now, as we look at the various issues that Paul tackles with the Corinthian Christians, a picture emerges where a really big part of what the Corinthian problem was their view of spirituality. That was a huge issue for them. They thought that being spiritual meant discarding the mundane things of life and embracing the invisible, otherworldly, and perhaps overly mystical. So, for example, they advocated an ascetic view of sex. Now, asceticism was a Greek movement that was all about denying pleasure, saying it's good for a man to not touch a woman. They may have blurred the line between physically male and female, prompting a mention of homosexual behavior in chapter 6, along with an extended response about men and women in the church in chapter 11, and then briefly in chapter 14. Some of them even saw no need for a bodily resurrection. I suppose they would have been dualists, emphasizing the importance of the immaterial, spiritual reality rather than the grossly physical as they might have seen it. And that prompted Paul's magnificent response. One of my favorite chapters in the Bible, in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, all about the resurrection of the dead. And it's quite likely that in their worship, some of them wanted to transcend the natural or rational and act in a state of ecstasy or altered consciousness, something that would have been familiar to some of them in the paganism of the Roman Empire and the cults that they would have come out of. Now, that was a big part of the Corinthian problem, I think. And I think that claim is well supported by Paul's discourse on tongues and prophecy in 1 Corinthians 14. So after that big, but I think useful introduction, let's start progressing through this section of the letter. So let's start at verses 1 to 5. You could even have your Bible open if you wanted to. 1 Corinthians chapter 14, 1 to 5, which can be summarized by saying, everything we do when we come together as the church should be done in love for the other. Giving a prophecy that people can understand is therefore better than bringing a message or a prayer in a language that they don't understand, because the former edifies them, but the latter does not. Now, St. Paul begins the chapter by saying that the Corinthians should desire gifts. Literally, they should desire spirituals. Pneumatica is the Greek word, perhaps meaning spirituality more general, but in the way of love, rather than whatever it is they were doing right now, which is not the way of love. They should desire to prophesy rather than to speak in other languages, because the one who speaks in a tongue, or language, that's what that means, builds up himself, but the one who prophesies builds up the church. Now notice something here. I have heard or read countless times, and this may be the most important thing you hear in this video. Countless times I've heard that the purpose of speaking in tongues in private is to edify yourself. See, look. St. Paul says that anyone who speaks in a tongue edifies himself, and that's a good thing. So, tongues can be used as a private prayer language where you pray, you do not understand anything you're saying, and you are edified. That is a terrible handling of this passage. I think you haven't even read it carefully if that's what you think it means. In context, he who speaks in a language edifies himself is not helpful advice on the purpose of speaking in other languages. Quite the opposite. It's a stinging rebuke telling us what the gift is not for. When the Corinthian audience heard the words edifies himself, the appropriate reaction would have been to turn red with shame. Throughout this whole chapter, Paul is trying to get the Corinthians to change their attitude. They had been making a show of their own liberty and spirituality at the expense of the good of the wider body of believers. When it came to the use of the gifts, Paul's trying to show that the use of all the gifts should be governed by love, and their purpose is to benefit others. That's their fruit, right? That's the goal of these things. If you bring a message in another language, then it must be interpreted so that whatever you say can benefit the others present. If it isn't interpreted, if they don't understand it, then they're not edified, because edification requires understanding. Otherwise, you're just benefiting yourself if they don't understand, which is not loving, and so it's not permitted. Treating tongues as a private tool where one speaks in a language that they don't understand for the purpose of self-edification really misses the point of Paul's distinction between tongues and prophecy. I've already alluded to it, but I want to make it more explicit and more emphatic because I think it's important and it can change the way you behave in church when you come to understand this. Why is prophecy edifying in a way that an uninterpreted message in another language is not edifying? Why is one edifying but the other is not edifying? Because the hearer understands it. You have no trouble understanding that when it comes to prophecy. You have no trouble understanding that when it comes to speaking in another language and interpreting it for the church. You understand that the audience becomes edified when they come to understand what is being said. We understand that. If they didn't understand it, then they would not be edified, which is why interpretation is required. So how could Paul possibly have meant that a person who is praying privately in a language that they don't understand could be edified by what they're saying? There would be a complete contradiction. Throughout this chapter, Paul presupposes that a person understands what they are saying when they speak in a language that the others do not understand. He never introduces the highly unexpected assumption that they speak, but they don't know what they're saying. Indeed, I say, when he describes what happens without interpretation, he says, "You may give thanks well enough, but your brother is not edified." In other words, yes, it makes sense to you, you understand it, but it doesn't make sense to your brother. So you are edified, but he is not. So following on from this, Paul uses the analogy of musical instruments. If you just played random notes, then it wouldn't really be music, would it? Oh, maybe some kind of avant-garde thing, but no. But that's how it sounds if you speak in a language that the other person does not understand. The sound has no meaning to them. Paul says, "And so it is with you," in verse 9, i.e. in the case of speaking in other languages in Corinth. Paul observes in verse 10 that there are many languages in the world, but if I don't know the meaning of the language, then I am a foreigner to the speaker, and they are a foreigner to me. So the comparison to a foreigner makes sense, because speaking in a language in this passage refers to a person speaking in a foreign language, i.e. one that they understand, but I don't. Now, beginning in verse 14, if I pray in a tongue, which just means language, we know that, my spirit prays, but my mind is unfruitful. And this is another one that is subject to modern misinterpretation. Some people read this as though Paul had said instead, if I pray in a tongue, my spirit prays, but my mind does not pray. Not what he said. The New Living Translation does a horrific job. It says, my spirit is praying, but I don't understand what I am saying. That's just false. That is not at all what Paul said. It's not implied by what he wrote either. Paul says that his spirit prays, but that his mind or understanding, nous can mean either one of those things, his mind or understanding is unfruitful. And this is the only time in this passage where Paul explicitly mentions the fruit of prayer or prophecy. Now, in all of this discussion, like a persistent theme that Paul will not let go, what do we find that might amount to the concept of bearing fruit? At a quick count, I saw Paul referring to this 7 times in the chapter. Edification is the fruit. The fruit of using the gifts as they are intended in the church is the edification of the church. If Paul prays in a language that the others present do not understand, and there's no interpretation, then sure, he gives thanks well enough, what he says in verse 17. In other words, his spirit prays just fine, but that's internal to himself. That's in his own understanding or mind. And what is in his own understanding or mind doesn't bear any fruit. It doesn't edify the church. Next, Paul goes back to quoting from the Corinthians and then replying to them. What should I do then? I will pray with the Spirit, but I will pray with the mind also. I will sing with the Spirit, but I will sing praise with the mind also. Otherwise, if you say a blessing with the Spirit, how can anyone in the position of an outsider say the Amen to your thanksgiving, since the outsider does not know what you are saying, unlike you? I added that bit in. For you may give thanks well enough, but the other person is not built up. I thank God that I speak in tongues more than all of you, and nevertheless, and Paul was a multilingual individual, bear in mind, nevertheless, in church, I would rather speak 5 words with my mind in order to instruct others also than 10,000 words in a tongue. That is a glossa, a language that people don't understand. Now, in light of contemporary discussions about speaking in tongues, something important stands out here. Now, I'm slightly departing from the way that most translations punctuate the above passage. Many translations do recognize Paul's practice of quoting and responding to the Corinthians, and they've punctuated accordingly, and I'm doing the same things here. But whether he's quoting them or not, he's starting out with their idea. I will pray in the Spirit, a very Corinthian thing to say, but Paul comes in, I will pray with the mind also. It's not like Paul is saying, listen, Corinthians, I want you to know that sometimes I pray with the Spirit, but with no understanding. And at other times I pray with understanding. No. This understanding of Paul misses the point. To pray with the Spirit does not mean without understanding. Just like to pray with understanding does not mean to pray without the Spirit. Paul would never have thought that. Instead, Paul is responding to those who say that they pray in the Spirit by saying, well, okay, but with understanding as well. Right? Don't leave that part out. It's not an either or. Paul is calling the Corinthians to not switch off and tune out in the ecstasy of incoherent worship, but to bring their full earthly, rational selves into worship, brains and all, praying and speaking in the Spirit and at the same time with understanding. Don't divorce the two. That's where Paul is. Now, this passage has, I think really unfortunately, served as the main basis of a modern Pentecostal or charismatic understanding of speaking in tongues, as a phenomenon of speaking ecstatically in a language in sounds that don't mean anything to the speaker, as a way of edifying yourself. But it is a modern phenomenon, and certainly a modern interpretation of this passage. In his commentary on this chapter, 1 Corinthians 14, John Calvin was able to say, as though it was not even controversial in his time, he said, the term, that is, he's talking about the term tongue, denotes a foreign language. What is meant by praying in a tongue appears from what goes before, to frame a prayer in a foreign language. It is lawful indeed to pray with the Spirit, provided the mind be at the same time employed, that is, the understanding. And he also says, but here a new question arises, for it is not credible, at least we nowhere read of it, that anyone spoke under the influence of the Spirit in a language that was to themselves unknown. For the gift of tongues was conferred not for the mere purpose of uttering a sound, but on the contrary, with the view of making a communication. For how ridiculous a thing it would be that the tongue of a Roman should be framed by the Spirit of God to pronounce Greek words which were altogether unknown to the speaker, as parrots, magpies, and crows are taught to mimic human voices. If, on the other hand, the man who was endowed with the gift of tongues did not speak without sense and understanding, Paul would have no occasion to say that the Spirit prays, but the understanding is unfruitful. For the understanding must have been conjoined with the Spirit. Now, although what I'm saying here may be jarring to people living in the modern world with a Pentecostal or charismatic background, it's actually pretty boring, pretty mundane and normal if you read this passage without that background. It may be like, this is how normal Christians read the Bible. Maybe it's a shock to you. Throughout church history, few people would even raise an eyebrow at what we've explored. And I like to think that as you've followed through the explanations that I've offered, they do make sense to you. You can see that what I'm saying is correct when it comes at least to what St. Paul had to say. The only reason that people today might find the charismatic experience of speaking in tongues in this passage is because they've been taught to. They've been influenced by the modern Pentecostal and charismatic movements. If St. Paul is left to his own devices, a Pentecostal theology of speaking in tongues doesn't appear at all.